the mic's on or not. So when I'm tempted to sort of project deeply, you're very lucky that I noticed that the mic was on, so I didn't project intensively through the mic. So you've seen me a lot today, Jessica Seddon, Institutional Architecture Lab. I'm particularly pleased that this panel on Toward a New Relationship with Nature is effectively the last word among the plenaries, and I think it follows very nicely from some of the comments in the new economic and finance models. We're in a little bit of a historical anomaly in the sense that we have a dichotomy, or a perceived dichotomy, between human and nature. It hasn't always been this way. It's a relatively recent anomaly. And it's one that I think many have observed in the different comments during the sessions. It's one that can be also quite destructive, to imagine that we are separate from nature, to imagine that we are somehow separate from other species, that we are independent, that we are in a position of being able to, yes, it is the Anthropocene, as many people say, but it is also that sense of distance is in some ways a delusion. But if you move and you say, okay, well, beyond the dichotomy, what is that moving into? What is the new relationship? What is the new interconnection, the new interaction? And that can take many forms, and I think the panel that we have here represents a variety of institutional innovations in exploring, in building different relationships. So I'll just briefly introduce the panel and then not take any more time. We'll move into sort of illustrations of a number of different institutional innovations and pathways for institutional innovation. Come back for a discussion and Q&A as with the other plenaries. So Piotr over here is, you may have seen his case, you may have seen the case of the mussels detecting water contamination for Poznan and effectively protecting the city of Poznan from water contamination. So Erin, you need a mic, and then come back up here. And that's one example of a relationship with another species and sort of working with a level of detection, of sensing that humans don't have. So we'll start with that. We'll move to Leena al-Olaimy, who has public-private planet partnerships, Symbaiosys, has a number of different interconnected ways of recognizing nature and building it into financial systems. So Leena will talk about some of her work. We'll move to Erin Ryan, who's here, and she'll speak about animals in the room, which is, again, an extension to move a little bit past recognition into relationships. How do we bring animals into the room as protagonists, interlocutors, joint co-creators of the kinds of arrangements that we have around farming, around conservation, around many other de facto interactions. Maja Groff, an international lawyer based in The Hague, will speak about her work with the Climate Governance Commission and some of the subsidiary initiatives underneath that in which knowledge, recognition, incorporation of different aspects of nature show up in international legal processes. And will be capped off in the end from Alfredo de Valle, who is a complexity governance expert, recognizing that at the end, building this relationship in the interconnected, complex system that we all are sort of hurtling through at the moment is a matter for complexity governance. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I also have to say, because we have such great panelists and because I want to ask them questions, I am going to be very strict about the time limit for opening remarks. So if I look like I'm being really rude and lunging at panelists, I just want to give you the backstory that everyone has been warned that they have 5 minutes. I'm granting an extra 6-minute grace period, but after 6 minutes, I will stand up and I won't lunge. So that's just a warning to everyone here that this is a prearranged bargain. All right, now with that note, over to you, Piotr, to speak about mussels in Poznan. Thank you.
Short movies.
Yeah.
razie ataku terrorystycznego, katastrofy ekologicznej czy innego przypadku skażenia wody, morze zamkną się. Dopływ wody do miasta zostanie wtedy automatycznie odcięty. Jeżeli woda zostanie skażona i trafi do nas, do kranów, to my się zatrujemy. One nas chronią. Do systemu podłączonych jest 8 osobników, których reakcję rejestruje komputer. Każdy osobnik ma do swojej skorupki przyczepiony magnes. Na wysokości drugiej skorupki zainstalowana jest sonda halotronowa.
Clamps-based monitoring system for water quality control and water intakes protection. Mussels are useful for water monitoring, response to toxins, valve closure is quick, reliably and easily measured. Clamps-based monitoring benefits, continuous monitoring of water quality and toxicant detection, image modification of personnel in a case of alarm via emails, alarms or SMS, graphical presentation of current and historical data, no constants remains required, analytical lab support. More than 12 million people in the world have access to water monitoring by mussels. 49 towns in Poland, 2 towns in Russia, this Yekaterinburg and Vladivostok, and 1 town in USA, Minneapolis. Monitoring the clam reaction. Hall sensor analyzes the activity of mussels by recording movement of magnets. The monitoring device, clam with attached magnet, stand and Hall sensor. This presentation. If water is okay, mussels are opening and water treatment plant going water to the water network. If some pollution goes to the water, mussels are closing shells and is situation alarming. Therefore, water treatment plant don't move water to the water network. The same is visualization or monitoring of computer. The first mussels are opening. After the appraise of the toxic substance, mussels are closing shells, activity of them go down. Waterworks company Aquanet in Poznań, Poland is providing safe water for citizens and also educating on water biomonitoring kits and different level students. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Piotr. I think those initial stills were from a movie called Fat Kath, and it's about 12 minutes long. There's this beautiful scene in it where an invisible hand holds the clam up and talks about acquiring some degree of sympathy with the muscles. There is a fair amount of infrastructure literature about knowing what's behind the wall, what's behind the tap, creates a new relationship, say, with water conservation and so on. And I would hope that perhaps as people recognize the service of the mussels, that there becomes a larger sympathy for the lakes. So we can come back to this. Piotr also works on a lot of lake conservation around.
Yeah.
So we'll come back to the spillover. I'll turn it over now to you, Leena, to speak about public-private partnerships, diversity on board, Symbaiosys, and all of these different initiatives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a journey, but I think first of all, I love the name for this panel, and I think we can't talk about this human-nature dichotomy without recognizing that nature isn't obviously just something to extract, but it's also not just a victim to protect. It's actually our biggest social and economic collaborator, because it's us just operating through different systems. We are nature, and our non-human nature counterpart, at least according to Bloomberg, is worth $180 trillion. Of course, we know you can't put a price on nature, but that's 1.5 times global human GDP. So when I've been working in the sustainability space for about 20 years, and around 10 years ago, there was all this discourse around how we need $2.3 trillion to bridge the SDG finance gap, and now it's like $4 trillion. But maybe the P that we're missing isn't private and public-private partnerships, maybe it's planet. And that's the question my co-founders and I started asking. What would a public-planet partnership look like that was mutually beneficial, where for that partnership to endure, you have to have mutual benefit and contractual collaboration? So we started developing this framework and tools, and also started harvesting. Did someone click my slides, or was that me by accident? Oh, can I control the slides? Thank you. So that's not supposed to be up yet.
There.
Okay.
Can you just go back to the holding slide, please?
So Poznan would be an example of case studies that we started harvesting, where we categorize them the way nature sort of categorizes relationships. Is it win-win or mutualism? Is it commensal, so win-neutral? Or is it parasitic? And parasitic can also be good for the larger ecosystem, but that's for another panel. Another example similar to Poznan would be biodiversity, which some of you may have heard of. So they basically take eDNA samples from beehives, and the bees are actually able to collect 1 billion data points just from visiting 1 kilometer square area. And biodiversity then uses that data to inform environmental policies to actually save the bees. So that would be an example of a win-win collaboration. And if you think of the cost of replicating that, so to partner with bees as data scientists, where there's no meetings, no PowerPoints, and you're not even being invoiced, and to replicate that with mini drones is just astounding, which makes the disparity in nature finance so much more jarring.
Could we just go, the slides will be controlled from the clicker, so can we go back to the, thank you.
So, I was gonna.
I think you have to click that way. Sorry.
Technical difficulties. Okay, now it's not working.
Which slide do you want to bring? There.
No, the first one.
Yeah, the first one.
Can we go to the Apple slide? Thank you.
Perfect.
So, as I was saying, so nature is actually not only the greatest innovator, it's also the greatest startup story, and it has scaled an entire planet and figured out what works with zero venture funding. So when people start talking about all this VC funding going towards nature, towards carbon capture technologies, it kind of blows my mind, because trees are like, hello, I've been doing this for hundreds of millions of years. I've already perfected this technology. And I am also providing all of these other co-benefits that other technologies don't provide. And so this is really the seed that kind of initiated Symbaiosys, which is a data platform that I'm building to quantify the financial value of ecosystem services in a way that businesses actually care about. So there are platforms designed for policymakers and for environmental scientists, but what about things businesses care about, like, for example, food resilience? Next slide, please. So bees don't invoice us for pollination, but maybe they should. And maybe mangroves, next slide, should be invoicing us for reducing insurance liabilities. So now we risk getting into actually just turning nature into an asset and commoditizing nature. So how do we avoid that? Because I'm obviously not trying to promote a new extractive model. So I think the key here is nature's economic rights. If every company is co-founded with nature and every government is in a public-planet partnership with nature, then these species and ecosystems should not only be able to invoice us, they should be able to pay us to conserve, to restore, to manage invasive species, and they should have a vote on the table, at the table. And then this is the kind of final piece of work that I'll wrap up with, which is around how do we bring nature-conscious governance into boardrooms. Diversity on board started for me as a human diversity initiative, and this year we've moved into multi-species diversity. So this isn't about how do we manage our nature risks and dependencies the way traditional ESG frameworks do, but actually, how do we learn from the way nature governs, and how do we learn from the way nature manages risks? Because anyone who's been in a natural disaster, whether it's earthquakes here, floods, wildfires, knows that we don't govern nature, nature governs us. And with this sort of shift in thinking, we're trying to get boards to think not just about board independence, which is an ESG metric, but board interdependence, to move from pay oversight to reciprocity. And I'll just pause there.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting thought experiment to also think about how much human institutions need to change if this kind of relationship were to scale. So if we did have this kind of, these set of mutual transactions, if we had this representation in board systems, that would create a lot of new institutional innovation requirements that go deeper into the next layer that may think it's separated from nature, but is actually not. So I think our next panelist, I have to really thank Erin Ryan for stepping in. She and her colleague, Melanie Challenger, co-founded or were part of creating an initiative called Animals in the Room. We've had several. Melanie, unfortunately, couldn't be here. Erin has agreed to step in and to represent Animals in the Room, and we've had several versions of the presentation and different aspects, so I have to extend a great thanks to you for being here to talk about an extension beyond the representation in the sense of a value or a sense or a piece of data into a much more political relationship and potentially political, and for figuring out how that might work when there are very different languages, expressions, preferences, and so on. So over to you, Ryan. Over to you, Erin. Thank you.
And is it possible, as Mel's, it's not going to work, her introduction, is it? The slide
Yeah,
that she...
Yeah, there's a transition issue
Okay,
there.
I suspected. So Mel actually sends her deepest apologies for not being here. She encountered many sort of systems failures on her way here from London. So I'll just read, if you don't mind, just for a couple of minutes, her opening remarks, and then I'll take it from there, since we sort of represent two different arms of Animals in the Room. She said, And I don't need to tell you, you're all very aware that we're living in a moment of crisis, where political, environmental, and social systems seem to be failing all around us. Many are now turning to nature for solutions, seeking ways to move beyond a narrow, human-centered perspective. While this instinct is promising, history suggests that overcoming anthropocentrism is deeply challenging, especially in times of existential threat, when people tend to retreat into human-centric thinking. Humanness and our own cultural identities psychologically buffer us from what we fear. And when times are tough, we tend to get more groupish, including human groupish. Even our attempts at nature-based solutions often remain subtly anthropocentric, framing nature in terms of how it can serve human needs, instead, rather than recognizing the distinct agency and autonomy of other living beings. We frequently reduce life to a generalized concept of nature, collapsing individual animals, for example, into an abstract whole, rather than acknowledging individuality and unique needs. But what if we tasked ourselves with listening to other living beings? Mel is a bioethicist working on climate and sustainability, and she says that having seen firsthand how failing to consider non-human perspectives leads to ethical blind spots and ineffective policies, especially around health and secure futures. She says we're yet to internalize the latest and most robust scientific evidence on life in our institutions. If Mel had been with us all here today, her provocation for us would be to first think critically about the scale of nature we should prioritize in our institutions, that scale being from the individual to the planetary, to mitigate the risks of repackaging anthropocentrism with a nature-friendly face. That mitigation begins with how we represent nature. Technically, how do we do it? But ends crucially with how we measure success. Is success for us? Success for the planet? For the ecosystem? Or for the other living beings in our midst? It's an ethical challenge of the highest order to get that balance right. Today, we do know that living beings are not mere machines running on genetic programs, but remarkable agents with preferences, some capable of communicating directly with us. Organizations like the Earth Species Project that you've probably heard about are working to decode communications, but we need formal mechanisms to integrate the voices and interests of non-human life into governance. Really listening and understanding who is out there, what matters to them, and taking on board those interests to transform us and our decisions. And what if our institutions formally and substantively included the perspectives of other beings in decision-making processes? Animals in the Room was born of this challenge. Mel and I and a group of multidisciplinary researchers came together 5 years ago to begin talking about this question. And we're now launching Animals in the Room as a nonprofit with a consortium of universities. We unite researchers in fields of human psychology, governance, arts, and tech to experimentally tackle this question of just how we represent animals in decision-making. And we enter the conversation via the individual, and we work our way up through those scales and back down. But our main task is to bring an experimental and evidence-based approach to this inquiry, pairing with institutions and agencies and communities that are interested in experimenting with us and going on this journey with us. And the goal is to scale this in a way that could be introduced into institutions. So, thank you.
Thank you, Erin. So, Erin and I, we had a very interesting conversation before this. Just some of the applications of this dialogue. So, for example, in the laws around industrial farms and the understanding of what is the set of procedures and processes that could support, say, pregnant pigs in high-intensity or concentrated animal feeding operations. How do you know what, I mean, other than sort of the broad unspeakables, as Edgar was speaking about, what is the source of the data with which the rules around comfort and meeting of basic preferences, even if you disagree with the definition of basic, what are the rules around the collection of that data? To what extent should we be dealing with the same ethical safeguards as you would with human subjects? There are a ton of questions that come up the minute that you poke even very, everyday regulatory decisions that I think speaks to the importance of this kind of experimental space. So this was a discussion about a particular scale, individual to all the way global. Moving back into the multilateral space, I wanted to welcome Maja Groff to speak about her work in international law and also in multilateral governance. How does this new relationship with nature get built?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessica, and seeing if my slides are working. Yep. Wonderful. So just a few words, overview, background on the work of the Climate Governance Commission and now the Planetary Governance Program I'm running. And our contribution and really main focus has been taking the international latest Earth system science as our base. If we take that as a base, as we believe we should, what would our governance institutions look like? We're giving particular attention to the international governance layer, but indeed to all the layers. How do they intersect, synergize in a harmonious way? And you see here the list of the various commissioners. We've been working with Johan Rockström as one of the co-chairs, Mary Robinson of the Elders, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, first female head of state of an African nation, and 3 youth commissioners, with Shea Bastida presenting indigenous Mexican perspectives. And we've had very interesting dialogues about indigenous knowledge and science and how those can work harmoniously together. So where are we now? Many have mentioned a poly-crisis. This is a quote from the Secretary General a few years ago now. He frames it, I think, in a really compelling way, stark and urgent choice, break down or break through. And we really have the conviction that part of the breakthroughs, really key breakthroughs, are on the institutions and governance. And this is why this conference is so important and what you are all talking about. So you're all probably aware of the planetary boundaries framework proposed first just in 2009. So it's a relatively new science-based framework. You can see that climate is only one of the planetary boundaries. We've overshot 6 of 9. And we've sort of shifted from just focusing on climate to planetarily, how do we actually move towards genuine Earth system governance, because so many of these boundaries are completely interrelated, like land use has to absolutely be addressed in order to tackle climate, et cetera. So another governance insight and our interdependence with nature is represented in a number of the newer economic studies coming out. This is from the Potsdam Institute, published in Nature, saying, okay, we're probably looking at an average of 19% decrease in GDP by 2050 along current trajectories. An even more recent study, this was the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries with University of Exeter, 50% GDP collapse on our current trajectories by 2050 or 2070. So these are obviously staggering sort of figures. So what are we dealing with in terms of nature at the international level? So this is, again, the Earth system, latest Earth system thinking and analysis for many scientists. You've probably heard of the tipping points. This is, some of the different big biophysical systems around the world that keep climate and other of our ecological systems stable, and they're interdependent. So this is an interdependent world where we are all connected, our civilizations, but also with the natural systems of the Earth. And this is another really, I think, great visualization by one of our collaborators, Common Home of Humanity. And they've proposed a very novel legal paradigm shift for international law, whereas we would keep our national sovereignty, yet have our whole Earth system functions recognized as common heritage, which we then manage together, which I think is really brilliant, the suggestions and work they're doing. So to move into solutions from where we are, the glass is sort of half full in the sense that we have already a whole host of international norms around international environmental governance, about 3,000 multilateral and bilateral environmental treaties. So what we tried to do in our report, released just before COP28, is on 2 tracks: an urgency track on tightening the screws on our existing international and other governance, and then medium term, like the next generation governance. And so we set out 10 near term and 5 medium term proposals with this overarching concept of moving towards, indeed, this Earth system governance imperative. And these are our top 10 near-term proposals. I won't go into them. We've prioritized a few, but just one example, for example, climate COP reforms, which there's a lot to do there, and there's actually uptake institutionally, and that's quite a vibrant space at the moment as we move towards COP30, but we address international climate finance, full Earth system scientific monitoring capacity, amongst other things. And this is just a slide from some of our experts working on next generation institutional architecture. This is sort of a blue chip proposal from former heads of state. In 2009, for example, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy wrote a letter about that we need to defragment our international environmental governance to move towards like a strengthened UNEP, a new agency. So we're really trying to seriously explore these various sound proposals. So just lastly, to end, you might say, okay, this is all well and good, these really, potentially very important steps forward for the international community, but how does it get done? What's the theory of change? And I just wanted to mention the Mobilizing an Earth Governance Alliance. We're building a smart coalition, multi-stakeholder with global civil society, like-minded states, and also with a private sector sort of facility and support to navigate through proven methods for international legal and institutional change. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really, yes, I see some people wanting to clap. So I don't want to hold off on the applause, but I think that's a really important reminder that nature is much, much more than other animals. And I think that some of the sort of the through line between some of these is that there's a sort of desperate need to recognize, respect, and adjust ourselves. I mean, the graph that Maja showed with the existing treaties, existing institutions, some of the defragmentation that could be done, the kind of bricolage that Kim Stanley Robinson was also speaking about yesterday, is very much possible, but it does require an adjustment in our human expectations and recognition of more than us on the planet. This is, of course, a massive systemic challenge. It is a complex challenge, and I would like to turn it over to Alfredo to speak about complexity governance and how it might be brought to bear to rebuild this relationship. I will pass the magic clicker and cross my fingers that it will work. So I think you have to click that way.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Sorry, this is the old presentation.
That's the old one.
No, that's the old one.
Can we work with it? Just if we move it quickly?
No, I can't.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So we'll come back to, how about we do this? We can reload the new one. We'll reload the new one. I'll make sure to resend it. And
Why
then
don't you keep talking and I'll check there that I have the right one.
Yeah,
okay?
So perfect. Why don't we do that? And we'll have to hold your thoughts on the complexity governance aspects of responding to all of these. This is one of those panels that, in thinking, rebuilding the relationship with nature, we're dealing with scales from clams to dialogues with animals, to multilateral governance, to reforming the financial system. And one of the questions that I actually have for each of you is, how did you pick your starting place? In the earlier conversations with you, how did you come into this? I mean, I heard a little bit about your professional trajectories, but why these pieces of the relationship with nature? So Leena, you're sitting right next to me and looking at me in horror, but how did you come to this, I am going to represent nature in this financial valuation? Why that?
Gosh, okay. It's a difficult question for me to not answer, honestly, but I don't know everyone that well. But I'm going to embrace just the maybe radicalism, and some people in the room will appreciate this. But honestly, I'd been in the sustainability space. I was working on PPP, and I did an interspecies communication retreat at a lion conservation in South Africa. So the idea is that before language, humans had this innate connection with nature. And the way I explain it to people in tech is it's like a brain-machine interface. You're interpreting electrical frequencies, and I got a download from nature that this was the next thing I had to work on. And as I was trying to conceptualize Symbaiosys, I was in the middle of the Serengeti, and there was all of these female big cats, lionesses, cheetahs, leopards. And again, I got this download that you need to actually walk the walk and go into business with nature, not for nature. So a lot of my thinking has come from just being in these almost guided by nature. And then the other part of it is, having been a sustainability consultant, I'm used to bridging the language of finance and business and being able to, obviously I don't usually share this part with asset managers, but it's also being able to communicate it in language that they understand and translating it into real business metrics. So for me, it was kind of a natural, it's like, what do I know how to do, and what am I being called to do, and where do I think I can make the most impact?
The reason I asked that question is in some ways trying to tease out these hypotheses of institutional innovators. How do you pick your opening point? And I think that combination of the personal, but also the recognition of the leverage of a very large class of powerful institutions and systems is one version that all of us can take. Maja, how did you pick your starting point, entry point?
Yeah, for me, I sort of was drawn into international law in The Hague because I was so passionate about international cooperation and environments. And I realized in the international system that there's this phenomenon of sort of amnesia, forgetting past intentions behind international law, for example. And I was really inspired by some of the early visionaries of international law and sort of their vision for an international legal system and governance, which really got me inspired to get into sort of macro international governance reform, and also seeing some extraordinarily successful smart coalitions of often lay people and citizens who came in as relative outsiders that helped to catalyze and lead major transformations in the international system. So it felt like a gap. And then I was working with an organization working on global catastrophic risk and climate, of course, and our ecological crises are a very serious international risk. And also I don't see this sort of international governance innovation sort of platform approach being applied yet the way it could. So there's a lot of scope for progress.
Yeah, I mean, starting with these things that could change in order to open up a potentially different governance that is built around Earth system realities. Mm-hmm. It's an important thing. Piotr, how did you come to this particular relationship with business?
If I started with this system 35 years ago, quality of water was much better like on this time. Therefore, I think if muscles helping us controlling this quality of water because Year by year, quality of water is more badly. Therefore, muscles helping us controlling this water. This is very important on this moment because quality is more badly like I start with this system 35 years ago.
Thank you. I think these common challenges, I mean, there's a certain commonality between humans drinking the water, mussels filtering the water, and recognizing that is important. Erin, animals in the room.
Well, about 25 years ago, I started out as a scientist, as an animal welfare scientist, so tasked with understanding the behavior and the interests and preferences of animals, predominantly in intensive food systems, but also apes, gorillas, and orangs living in captivity. And so as I went along, I noticed that a lot of what we were being asked to understand about these animals, that there was a lot being excluded from the science. We were deriving an understanding of their interests, but it was based on the environments that we provided them with. So it felt to me like we were getting, at best, a partial picture of what their capacities were and who they were as beings. And then we were hoping as scientists to incorporate that into policy. For example, codes of practice for the care and handling of farm animals in the Canadian government. But what it felt like we were seeing was the status quo being repeated over and over again, that we had reams and reams of data, but hearts and minds weren't being moved by any of the data. So I started to become curious about what was going on there, what the blocks were to uptaking the data and being moved by it to the extent that our behavior would actually change. So I started to study the interface between human psychology and animal behavior. And I think similarly for Mel, she was working in developing policy on gene editing and felt like a main stakeholder was missing from the table. And again, that it was a sort of crisis of empathy. So I think that's why we started to examine the idea that we could substantively include animals as stakeholders at the table. And my academic work began to explore that, and what I found was even by bringing animals into the room and making them present through a documentary shot from their perspective, like the perspective of a cow and calf being separated from one another, which is a standard practice in industrial agriculture, that the conversations completely shifted. And people started using a lot more empathetic language. People also became empathetically distressed. This was by no means a straightforward ability for people to engage with the perspectives of animals. So I was triggered into being deeply curious about the complexities of just what it would take for us to bring nature on our boards. And because animals communicate so readily to us and we have so much data on that, we decided to begin with animals as an entry point into that conversation.
Thank you. And I think those were all helpful, I think, because we'll be coming back into the system change in a second. But before we do get into the big complexity governance and the sense of the analytic shift that we need to make, I wanted to highlight, and I was pleased that we didn't pre-plan this, that there was a common thread that came in through here, which was the recognition of a pressure or of a gap that felt, you all use some degree of an emotional language, plus the recognition of a system that with a little bit of an innovation or a little bit of a tweak that's underway could substantially grow and scale that change in terms of impact. And I think that's the story of many places that things start, and that's a way of looking at institutional innovation that is, complementary to, I think, what Alfredo is going to tell us about, which is the general framework of complexity governance. So back to you, Alfredo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Learning to govern complexity, a key to a new relationship with nature. This is the one we have now. Complexity. How does nature work so smoothly? Simplification, the great deviation and its consequences. A viable alternative, transformative system thinking, and redressing the deviation, an action research program towards a nonviolent future. Let's start. These are two metaphors. Nature's complexity. The human brain has 80 billion neurons, each one linked to other 5,000 to 200,000, and it works. The human liver has more than 500 functions, each one in interaction with other organs. 70 years ago, Ross Ashby discovered how can this work? And he found, like chess or football, every component of nature interacts with other components of equivalent complexity, leading to a dynamic stability. That's called homeostasis. And this is a permanent dance. Nature is in this dance permanently, and it is there in both organisms and ecosystems. That's the essential thing, how they work. However, simplification. 400 years ago, this gentleman, Descartes, established analysis or simplification as modernity's paradigm, with three principles of thinking: separation or fragmentation, reduction, and abstraction. This paradigm is blind to nature's complexity, and the massive expansion of this paradigm is what deeply disturbed nature. Consequences, the planetary tragedies of the polycrisis. The social tragedies, hunger, migration, inequality, organized crime. The ecological tragedies, climate, desertification, biodiversity, and so on. These tragedies are highly complex. They involve many actors, conflicts, issues, relevant disciplines and culture. They are violent against humans and nature, and they are interdependent. They strengthen one another. So we have to do something. And how to govern high social complexity, which is the matter, which is what Maja talked about. Well, let's apply Ashby's law. We need to match social complexity by building an equivalent complexity via strong participation, bottom-up, co-creative. The method, I have been working on this for 50 years, participatory innovation practice for conducting complex social transformations. It builds effective and legitimate institutions. I cannot explain this now, later on if you're interested. Two experiences. In Santiago's hard geography, no air emergencies since 1999. 20,000 lives saved in Chile from traffic crashes over 25 years. A book just published, The Art of Governing Complexity with Theory and Practice. Yeah, it's in Spanish, it's available for translation. And finally, what can we do? There's a concrete proposal here. On the planetary tragedies, let's find potentials to deal with the whole complexity of each tragedy. Social tragedies and the ecological tragedies, the whole complexity. Just one example. With organized crime, what is being done today? They kill the head, but the ones below are far more violent than the one who was in charge. So no solution. We have to be a systemic view of the problem of crime and each other. On key communities, find their potentials to contribute to building nonviolence. For instance, educational communities. Education is simply reproducing and reproducing and reproducing Cartesian division of the understanding of the world. Yeah. Business communities, disciplines, communications, arts and letters. General aspects of this proposal. First, demonstrating the feasibility. Each one of these can be done. Yeah? Pilot experiences. Let's do pilot experiences and transfer knowledge from those pilot experiences. Applicable method, what I mentioned, it can be applicable in each of these cases. And finally, this program could be sponsored by a consortium of foundations and international agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. So I noticed a couple of similarities, actually, between Maja, some of the diagrams that you were showing about what's available, what could be arranged, what could be simplified, and some of your synthetic arguments as well, though at quite different scales and mechanisms. And I'm wondering, Maja, if you, in translating from some of the reorganization and simplification and adjustment to Earth systems that you recommend and have laid out, how does that work in the multilateral environment? What might be the starting points for achieving that kind of institutional end goal? And, you know, any thoughts on the methodology that Alfredo was laying out at a very different scale?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, really wonderful insights from Alfredo and resonate a lot. So in terms of, you know, our work to date, and indeed sort of what are some near-term urgent steps we can do within the current governance architecture, and then envisioning next generation institutions. And in the next generation institutions, the consultative or even legislative parts of those have really featured prominently. And those participatory elements, we're working with multiple partners who are really trying to drive that at the international level, but also connected to national, local, for example, ISWE, and they're trying to have a citizens climate assembly. So just that the participation and engagement, co-creation is really interesting, and that's indeed how we've done our work. But in terms of, I mean, I wouldn't say what we're suggesting is necessarily simplification. Maybe it's a simplification or consolidation of this unhelpful complexity in terms of, you know, this sort of spider's web of multilateral and bilateral environmental agreements, and this important proliferation of different, you know, environmental convention secretariats. Then again, like the natural reality is we have a whole Earth system that, and its component parts as a natural system, they are interrelated, and we have to think about managing the whole Earth system as a whole. And we know we're running really dramatic risks within the Earth system, potential tipping points, if we do not, you know, get our arms around managing the whole Earth system. So we talk about defragmentation, consolidation. So one of the near-term proposals we have is just springboarding off of a proposal from the Secretary General for an emergency platform facility that the Secretary General could convene, and no new institutions, just a platform that could be convened in the light of an urgent risk or global shock. For example, this would have been helpful during the pandemic, COVID-19. And what we're suggesting is this should already be convened for Earth system risk, planetary emergency. Some scientists frame it very strongly in that way. So that could be a high-level coordination and sort of staging point to inform the international community, the highest levels of political leadership, and also get all key institutions relevant, Bretton Woods institution, UNDP, the Climate COP Secretariat, UNFCCC, et cetera, to think together and act with the requisite urgency. Then in terms of next generation governance, we're consulting the pathway, one of the parts of our pathway to try to support the international community for, how do we strengthen UNEP? How, should we move to a World Environment Organization, a Global Environment Agency, as has been suggested? And we're consulting, for example, with UNEP officials, experts, UNDP experts also, like what are the key functionalities, and doing that community sort of outreach and consultation, which is part of the pathway, building a community of practice, but also introducing simple ideas that are obvious in their rationality. Of course, we have to strengthen international governance. So part of the pathway is just starting the conversation seriously and getting groups and experts involved in serious consultations, discussions about what our new architecture should look like. So this is also part of the crowdsourcing and participatory approach to actual creation of the new institutions.
So it struck me actually, so Maja's description of that sounds very similar to Alfredo, the conversation you and I were having on Monday night about some of the work with Santiago in bringing people together to identify ways to address air quality. Do you have any thoughts or advice on how the kind of praxis that you're speaking about can be operational at a multilateral level? Is it fully fractal, or is there something different?
Yeah. I would say, and since institutions is the main subject here, I think there's something very important is that institutionalism should come after, structures, formalizing the structures should come after one have clear what to do. And I think that's essential, architecture or institutions follow understanding and strategy and clear strategy, and not the other way around. In our case, what we let me explain quick. Santiago is a city with mountains on the east, mountains on the north, 8 million inhabitants, and winds blowing precisely towards that corner, and that's where the city is. Highly contaminated, and what we did was to bring together citizens and government officers. First, understanding, and I think a key word here is understanding. It's not information, it's not knowledge, it's higher than that, understanding. Why is this going on? And that was done through a tool of my method that's called the action map, which is a tool that lets you understand the whole complexity in one single page. It shows you. So we prepared through participation the action map of the cleaning needs to clean the air. And then from that, the required innovations were defined, and around 200 innovations were, very concrete innovations were defined. And on that basis, then the government, but the definition of the innovation and of the map were done participatively, from bottom up, absolutely. There was not a blue plan by the government, then people come and validate it, which is usually called participation. That's not at all what I understand for. Strong participation comes really bottom up. The ideas come from the people, not from the technicians. And it succeeded. We have not had any emergency since 1999. Of course, we are not like next to the ocean like the city. But it is, and beyond that, the management system for this, the organization for this, kept innovating and added 3 or 4 additional pollutants to the being governed by the system. But the main point was the whole complexity of the problem was first understood. Then we went to define the innovations and implement them.
So I think I wanted to bring out the remarkable similarity between the first act of recognizing the mountains and the wind and just the meteorological and chemical factors, in addition to the emissions, and the Earth system realities. And then the process of creating space for human institutions and humans to reorganize, working with existing entities, and then coming back together. But I don't want to leave out the other part of nature, the animals. So I have one question for Erin, Leena, and Piotr. And the question is really, each of you talked about a different type of relationship terrain. So animals in the room is conversational, potentially political, interactive. Some of the slides that Leena showed were, in some ways, I'd say more equitably transactional. Should the bees be invoicing us? Should mangroves be invoicing us? Can we recognize that there is an exchange of value that is not simply humans to assume and appropriate? And Piotr, your relationship is in some ways the muscles, and the way that you talk about it, the muscles in you were solving, recognizing a water quality. You're using your different sensing abilities. What, 10 years from now, if you are wildly successful in having the conversation, the exchange, the collaboration, what kind of organization might that look like? What might that look like 10 years from now if you're successful in scaling those three relationships? So Erin, if animals are in many more rooms, what might that take? What might that look like?
Well, part of it is to say we don't really know, and this to me is kind of exciting, because in speaking to it being a bottom-up approach and acknowledging complexity and the ideas coming from humans, we posit that some of our greatest ideas can come from the animals themselves, and that we're not really engaging with the potential novel solutions that are out there because we haven't really substantively included animals as political subjects of justice. So the next 5 years is deeply experimental. We're working with a number of different communities in real world, looking at real world problems of coexistence or in our food systems or in development, and we're trying to understand that complexity. This is really onerous, really slow, very expensive, and so in 10 years, if we could come to understand some of this complexity, what it takes to package the information for people to be able to receive it, to overcome the human biases so that they're able to access those novel ideas that come from the animals, from their interests. Hopefully, I hope we can do it in 10 years, we're able to pivot to being service providers and to build some capacity and to offer some solutions at scale for institutions to use to be able to bring animals into their decision-making processes, whether that's at universities on animal care committees or at the UN when you're developing your environmental policy, just some solutions to be able to use technology, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, the arts, to overcome those barriers and engage with more radical solutions.
Thank you. That'd be a very large and complex conversation. Leena, thoughts on if the mangroves did start invoicing us, if the bees did start, how might that look 10 years from now as a new organizational form?
So I wouldn't call it transactional, because I think there's no way we could compensate nature for what it truly provides, so it's not even, a question. But I think that sometimes I think of nature finance as, like, imagine if we took the issue of gender equity, and we said we're going to put all this money into gender equity, but we're not going to give women rights over their wages. Their husbands are going to get the wages and determine the value. And that's sort of what we're doing with nature finance. So giving nature economic rights is really, and giving nature rights in general, but I think economic rights is really central to shifting financial and economic systems. And I also think that the modern or like Western concept and scientific and economic concepts of value need to be integrated with indigenous, traditional, ancient wisdom concepts of value that are actually life-sustaining. So it's also bridging the two. And then while we're on the subject of reciprocity, ecosystem services should have their own ISIC economic activity codes. So this is what I would see in the future. But equally, humans should also have ecosystem services that we perform for nature, because when you have rights, you also have responsibilities, and we need to be performing our ecosystem services to the larger Earth system, whether it's conservation, restoration, managing invasive species. And I think the ultimate kind of, bringing this all together in 10 years or hopefully sooner for me as an organization is launching an initial public planet offering. So having an IPO with nature as a shareholder that owns more than 50% of the shares and is basically represented by nature stewards, whether it's conservationists, scientists, indigenous communities, and actually having a veto vote on board decisions that are not life-sustaining.
I think we just heard blue marble coming into the room here as a, not so speculative future. Thank you very much. And reciprocity is a much better word than transactional. I thank you for that correction. Piotr.
I said in my presentation about waterworks company Aquanet in Poznań educating kids and students, but it's not only students and kids from Poznań, all district Wielkopolska area. It is near 5 million people. It is very important. Made good prognosis on future. It will be big population, 5 million people educate. I think if will be success with understand why protection quality of water is important.
From a shared project comes a recognition of shared interests. There's actually a growing institutionalization of these kinds of work with other species as sensing. The Internet of Animals is a case that was written up before IID. Karen Becker has a book, Gaia's Web, which goes into also some of the different ways that relationship between humans and other species could be more reciprocal as well in generating this kind of intelligence. And there are numerous other examples, so it's a big and growing field. I've monopolized the conversation. We have 22 minutes left if there are questions from the audience. Alberto. Up, right here, Mark.
So this is really me being ignorant, but I would like to know from the people that are given thinking to the legal aspect of this in the room to elaborate a bit on how integrating nature into governance is going to work. And I'm thinking about, we used to think not all humans were entirely human. And so the way that was corrected was by giving these other categories of lesser humans rights so that they would be fully integrated in the human community. And that, in our tradition, seems to be attached to individuals. Individual specimens of a human species have rights. And so I kind of struggle to imagine this for nature, do individual spiders have a right? You know, how's that going to work? Can you jail a spider for violating the human the rights of a fly? How's that going to work? Sorry, this is maybe very naive, but
so just really
I
quickly,
struggle.
I mean, in the 15th century, pigs, roosters were jailed. Actually, they were executed for murder, or for a rooster. There was a rooster who was executed for laying eggs. And one, before I turned it over to the panelists, but I just wanted to distinguish between rights and representation, because I think one of the messages that has been coming up is the act of recognizing statistically is a big piece. So for example, in the US, we had the 3/5 compromise, which was that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of districting for electoral representation. That is a statement that is a statistical statement, but it has political implications. So I just wanted to call back the importance of full recognition in addition to voice for this kinds of transition. Anyone want to take that question from Alberto? How might it look like? I'm looking at all of you.
As the lawyer.
Exactly.
We haven't, at the Commission, we haven't focused specifically on the rights of, which is a very vibrant area of initiatives and thinking, and also practical experiences and experiments. So, for example, in Ecuador, there have been some very promising developments there. New Zealand ecosystem with legal personality, influenced very much by Maori thinking, also Ecuador indigenous thinking. So there are these progressive steps and experiments at the national level. From my perspective, at the international level, from my perspective, I'm more interested to see how the practice develops at the national, to get best practices. How can this work, practically? How can it be operationalized in the various legal systems? So I'm talking to these people, on a semi-regular basis, and I can connect you if you really want to dig in and get into the nitty-gritty.
I can maybe just add to that.
Leena and then Alfredo.
There are definitely legal precedents. New Zealand, and I think you can probably speak to this, but the Wanganui River was given personhood rights after the Maori tribe was saying the river is our ancestor and had been fighting for years, I think, or decades. And then finally, when the river was recognized as a person, two people, humans, were appointed to represent the river in court. There was someone from the Maori tribe and someone from the government. And then they developed, I think they spent around $1 million on developing a legal framework. What are the river's rights? What are the river's responsibilities? And I think, unlike human rights, which, we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is like standard, with nature rights, it's very different because nature rights are not human rights. Rivers will have different rights than ants and have different responsibilities and parts to play within the ecosystem. And I think that's what makes it so interesting and complex. And again, if you are interested in digging deeper, there's a lot of different legal centers that specialize in the rights of nature, like the Earth Law Center is one, the Environmental Community Legal Defense Fund is another one, and happy to also connect you.
There's also speculative fiction on this. I mean, Annalee Newitz's Terraformers is post-interspecies compacts and works through the sharing of intelligence. Alfredo, you had a thought on this?
Yes.
Erin, you were leaning forward.
The spider and the fly are part of an ecosystem. And if we keep doing what we're doing, we will have no rights, no spiders, no flies. The point is how we change what we're doing. Your question about 10 years from now, that's what I want to answer now, to give my view about that. What I would like to see in 10 years is not to go through what I did go about some 5-6 years ago. We won a project jointly with the British University and with researchers from Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico to do the following. Work on the soil erosion at the regional level, at the level of a basin, river basin, full river basin, not at a small level, but And we applied this method. Yeah, we found about 64 concrete innovations. We had the action map first, those concrete innovations. We have a clear design for the governance system to implement those innovations to recover the region from erosion. Just to give you an idea, soil erosion now gives rise to about 12 million hectares per year lost worldwide. Every year, 3 times the size of the Netherlands are poured into oceans and lakes every year. Now, what does that mean about food, migrations,
So before we go
and
down
so
this
on?
path, though,
Let me complete.
we were on a stream of the recognition, and I just don't want to break that for right now. We can come back to the impacts, but I want to make sure that we stick with Alberto's question on what might this look like in terms of the representation of this issue.
I think, I cannot talk, I'm not a lawyer, and about representation. I think we are misrepresenting tremendously nature. From the time we started with Cartesian thinking, we cannot understand. We don't understand at all nature. I showed this metaphor of the football or the nature and the spider and the fly are part of the dance of nature. Yeah. But the problem is we are destroying it. And so there's no rights for nature left if we keep doing what they say. But if we recover nature, then nature will recover its rights. The 8 billion years and so on. Well, I think that's in my view, the main question, the main issue I'm interested in is how can we recover from this huge damage we have been doing? And I think we can. I think we can recover from that, provided we start looking at the whole system in practical terms, not just analytical terms. We can analyze, we can keep analyzing, and writing millions of papers about what's going on, Anthropocene, etc. But we are not acting. And my main question, what I want in 10 years, is to have at least some of these systemic studies, action-oriented studies going on, so that we don't lose again what I was telling at the beginning. I was very highly frustrated. We had identified 60 innovations, very concrete. I have got even the money to put in motion the governance system, but the person who had to lead that from one university, her priority was writing papers because the university obliged her to write papers, and we got no manager, no project, and so on. And all that was lost. I hope in 10 years that will not happen again.
So, but I think that was also Alberto's question: is what does this look like, and where does it start? So, coming back to this, what's the start of getting to this, Erin?
Right, so I think it's a great question. It's at the heart of our work, and the movement is varied. Our legal allies are tackling this by looking at precedent in the courts and how we confer rights to animals. For animals in the room, we're taking a different tact, and we're trying to remove as much as possible the human hands on our interpretation. Will always be the proxy for how we interpret the world, but we really want to use robust scientific evidence on the interests of animals, because it's, as much as possible, it's non-hierarchical. We are presented with an individual. This is like if I text you and say horrible things and I can't see your face, well, I don't really know what's going on with you. I'm less moved by what your experience is. if we never invite an animal into the space in any way, shape, or form, we're fundamentally, proximally, and imaginatively blocking ourselves off from the experience of this individual. So our work starts at the beginning, and we attempt to understand first the psychological profiles of our participants in our deliberation processes, their propensity to take the perspectives of others, how socially dominant they are, what their circle of moral, how far their circle of moral concern extends out. Then we trial a bunch of different interventions to bring people into a psychological and attentional state of deep listening and being willing to take the perspectives of others. This is totally bound up with interpersonal human issues. So for example, if you have a conflict, a coexistence conflict, and one party believes that it's the other party's problem or that it's intractable, we're not going to get very far in taking the perspectives of animals or nature. So we have to figure out how to intervene at a whole bunch of different levels. Then we have an information layer where we understand the policy mandate, the problem that's before us. We experiment again to find out what's trustworthy information for people, what they find to be trustworthy information, because it's not the same for everybody. Then we substantively include the animal. We do this through the same as we would in health research. We get a cohort of individuals, we look at their interests, and then for animals we develop a proxy for that, and we could bring in other forms of technology like virtual reality and artificial intelligence and test those proxies of representation. We can bring in images of the animals, we can get people to interact in underwater spaces with animals, just anything that we can do to break the anthropocentric frame. And then we evaluate what the effect is on the decision makers and the decisions themselves and look at some longitudinal data for the animals, for the ecosystems, for flourishing.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And while people are gathering their question, I'll just point out that in the, I believe it was in the 70s, there was an architectural plan for a dolphin embassy. The plans were drawn up. The idea was that humans and dolphins have common interest and there's much to learn, and a space that actually was conducive for humans and dolphins to both exist and be comfortable in. Never actually got built, I believe, but the plans were quite extensive. Question from here. Thank you.
Comment and then a question. Coming from an Indigenous perspective in New Zealand, just wanted to touch on a few things that were said. And great panel, by the way. I feel that some of the complexities in life often need a simple solution. Indigenous people, having lived with nature since time immemorial, tend to come into these complex situations with simple answers from nature. Underlying some of the things that have been said is the simple fact that if we can change our relationship with nature, a lot of those simple solutions may come forth. For example, our relationship, using legal personhood to a proxy relationship that we have to Sky Father, Earth Mother. All of these things are starting to come through. Similarly, right through to the voice and the rights of whales. And so that concept is now filtering through into potential declarations for the oceans. Underlying all of that is a simple relationship that we as humans have with nature and animals, because we are one and the same. I guess to help advance some of the thinking, perhaps for next time, is how might we bring more Indigenous thinking into discussions like this based on some of the experiences that I think some of you have had, to come up with these old relationships, very old relationships with nature, to form new relationships with nature. So yeah, perhaps there's some examples or some ideas on how we might bring Indigenous voices into this space more.
Thank you. It was well said, and my quick answer is hopefully with your advice the next time we have this. Do you have thoughts on this, Leena? I know this is something that you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, so I work with a lot of ecosystem services valuation scientists, and when I was at COP16, I actually sat with as many indigenous leaders as I could to understand. I know you can't put a price, or you can't value nature, but you can put a price on ecosystem services. So how can we, and I know indigenous communities are also not homogenous, so how can we take these different conceptual models of value and integrate them into more modern economic systems, not only to bridge, and I don't remember which indigenous community this is from, but the notion of two-eyed seeing, so that bridging the kind of Western approach with the indigenous traditional knowledge, not only to bring that knowledge and that concept of real value or a different conceptual model of value into economic systems, but also to help indigenous communities who are trying to raise money to steward nature to communicate value in a way that will actually get them the funding. So I would love to also talk to you if that's something that you're willing to give your thoughts on.
Any other thoughts from the panelists? Great. So we have time for one more quick question, if there is one. Otherwise, I have a quick request for each of the panelists, which is that we've talked about, a number of different sort of macro, micro actions that can be taken to institutionalize and to create institutions that support a new relationship with nature. I think there's more commonality than we started out with necessarily in the beginning, but I'd like, if you have one piece of advice for the institutional innovators you've met in the room, for people as individuals or professionals, on what they can do to accelerate this new relationship in their worlds, what is that piece of advice?
I'm just going to go with the first thing that comes to my mind because I think there are so many pieces to this puzzle, and maybe it connects to what you were saying. We have lived so divorced from the natural world, and we're ensconced in this paradigm that says that we're separate. And of course, it's ruining us. And in my experimental work, I find that people desperately need the invitation to be able to know that, to take that leap into conjecturing about the experience of another being, of relating to another being. Of course, we can bring multiple lines of inquiry to bear on these knowledge claims, but I think being willing to bring in as many guides and stakeholders to shepherd people along that path to opening themselves up to seeing the world differently. It sounds easy in a way. It's terribly complex. And then, in another way, it's not difficult at all. If that makes sense.
No,
we have to come back to something that's within ourselves that we've seemed to have, at least in the Western world, it's seemingly utterly forgotten.
Well, Bridie, I don't know if she's here, but we were talking outside about the importance of multi-perspective analysis. If there's one institutional innovation, if there's one thing to embed, multi-perspective analysis, just expand that perspective. Yes. Alfredo, thoughts, succinct advice for...
Very, very short. I would like to add something to what I said. I said that institutions should come after, or formalization, institutionalization, after having clear a path on what we want to do. Then we institutionalize in order to do that, and we have a governance system for that. Yeah. I want to add something else, which is the proposals cannot come from only one sector of society. Yeah? Government, business, university, civil society. All four need to work together. Yeah. In my experience, I have run many workshops with people from all four, and the initiatives that come are fantastic, extremely rich, complex, clear, yeah, practical. But whenever it's only one, only business, only governments, yeah, things are very poor. Yeah. So that's basically my additional point.
Thank you. Leena.
So actually, it's a great segue because, yes, I think all sectors need to be involved, but my advice would actually, or maybe even a call of action, would be for the policymakers in the room, because what I often hear from the private sector is, even if we're willing, we're the players, we're not the referees. We need the institutions to set the rules. So I know we have a lot of UNDP and UN folks and policymakers, so maybe a question for you would be, what would it look like if you reimagined the UN, every UN agency to be co-governed with nature and actually set a framework for other governments and countries and institutions to follow?
Maya.
Yes, so couldn't agree more about the new institutions, and I think it's really exciting. We live in it's a very challenging time, but also a very exciting time, where we see that the different threads of innovative thinking and reconnecting. So absolutely, how do we engage tangibly in building these new next generation institutions and their processes? But just a few underlying points which have been inspired by this conversation. A lot of, in terms of restoring our relationship with nature, place in nature, it's also about our relationships with each other on the planet. Empathy coming up a lot. And so this is about human community solidarity also. What we're doing is trying to repair our relationships across the board. We can't solve the nature challenges unless we address the social exclusion, economic inequality challenges. How do we have solidarity to share and distribute the incredible wealth we have on the planet? These are really fundamental issues of empathy, solidarity, connection. For me, talking about the Earth system science, I find it so fascinating. This new science is absolutely incredible, extraordinary. Planetary boundaries, the tipping point science, again, very alarming, but also incredibly fascinating, and just understanding where we're at in terms of the civilizational inflection point on planet Earth. This phenomenon that astronauts have, this overview effect. We have this actually really tiny, fragile planet, and we have to figure out how we properly protect, relate, live peacefully on it. And last, indigenous traditions. I come from North Vancouver Island, which is Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And what I hear again and again from my friends and colleagues is, indeed, these core values. How do we actually sink into the core values and learn from them relationally with nature, with each other? And the last message I had from one of my friends, Chief Bobby Joseph in Kwakwaka'wakw territory, he said, it's time for humanity to unite. This was his key message. He said, this is the most important thing, that we have to recognize our interdependence, which, again, making right these various relationships.
Thank you for bringing that up.
I short about relationships between humans and institution. Usually, water treatment plants is protected because it is very important institution. In Poznań, if is good thinking direction of this institution, can be education still to young people and students. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think thank you with those last words of advice. We're 3 minutes over, so I'll just offer 3 points of summing up. One, thinking about nature is everything from the chemical, physical, biological, large energetic cycles that are highlighted in earth system science to animals, plants, other species, that there are multiple scales, and to call it all nature is a gross reduction of an enormous amount of complexity. Two is that this importance of reciprocity, of seeing, of adjusting, of respecting, of not simply grafting another thing into our systems, that's not crossing the dichotomy. That, you know, one of the messages that I've heard across the panel is the need to adjust human systems in order to build this relationship with a complex surroundings. And then last is that part of what institutional innovation probably has to be is a fair amount of experimentation and blundering around and revisiting of human and ways of thinking, values that we've forgotten and we need to remember. And we need to, you know, finally remember that we are a we in this, and that this time to figure out how to go back to building the relationship is important to do before codifying everything, so that we don't just recreate a new misrepresentation and dichotomy. So with that, maybe the next Istanbul Innovation Days can be about institutionalizing the experimentation in the new relationship with nature. So that's my advice and request for UNDP. Thank you. Thank you all. We're 5 minutes over. I know there's coffee outside. Thanks.